My name is Opam Bogoto. I'm the Managing Director for Advisory at SNG Grant Thornton. We're looking forward to a very engaging session with everyone in attendance today. The education sector in South Africa faces a number of challenges, including decaying infrastructure, overcrowded classrooms, poor educational outcomes, all of which perpetuates inequality and fail many of our children as a society. We also understand the impact that the COVID pandemic had when it comes to this sector. But the positive side of things is, despite this and other challenges, access to higher education, universities, and TVET colleges has increased significantly during the past decade. Based on the UN Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization standards, South Africa continues to dedicate a significant amount of its annual budget and also households' budgets towards formal education in the higher education sector and also basic education. There's also opportunities for the sector when it comes to new models, new ways of delivering, new ways of engaging with stakeholders and students in particular, and also opportunities to form new partnerships and collaborate better going forward, and also leveraging latest technologies in this space. We as a firm, SNG Grant Thornton, we understand the importance of this sector, and we understand that as a firm and also similar firms in our sector, we potentially have to do more to contribute towards a number of initiatives that are undertaken by the sector to ensure that there is long-term sustainability of the sector. We see the improvement that we all expect as a society. And we therefore understand the need and the importance for partnerships with organizations within this sector. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, without wasting a lot of time, please allow me, and it also gives me pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Ahmed Bawa, CEO of University South Africa, USF. In this capacity, he's a member of the board of directors for USF, the representative association of all 26 public universities of South Africa. Until April 2016, Professor Bawa was Vice Chancellor and Principal of Durban University of Technology, DUT. From 2012-2013, he was Chair of Higher Education South Africa, HISA, which became USF in July 2015. Prior to that, Prof held senior positions at universities in South Africa and in the USA. Among others, he held the position of Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Natal and at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from Dahan University. He also done work in areas of higher education studies and in the area of science and society. He served on several national policy development teams in the post-1994 period in areas of science, technology, and higher education. He was a researcher for the National Commission on Higher Education and was an inaugural member of the National Advisory Council on Innovation till 2002. As a firm, I think we can learn a thing or two and quite a lot from the prof around innovation. It's probably an area to engage further. He's fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa, as well as the Academy of Science of South Africa, of which he was one of the inaugural vice presidents. He is currently a member of the Council of the Academy. He also served as chair of the board of the Foundation for Research Development, Telkom in Sanlam, and was vice chair of the board of the Atomic Energy Corporation. He serves on several international advisory boards. He has been a recipient of many awards. Among them was the Transformative Leadership Award, bestowed on him by the University of Pennsylvania, Netta Center for dedication on producing significant societal change and to working tirelessly, enabling the institutions in South Africa to realize many goals. Professor is also well known for advocating university responsiveness to the local context. Professor will stay with us, I think about around 11 or so, due to time pressures. So as he delivers his speech, please do feel free to post your questions on the text and make sure that the session itself is interactive. With those few words and a very brief introduction to a very long CV of the professor, over to you, Professor. Looking forward to your address. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mbokoto, and I want to just appreciate very much your introduction. Thank you so much. It gives me great pleasure really to spend this time with you, and I hope that what I share with you will be useful to you. And I just want to take this opportunity of thanking Mr. Mabuto Mtembo for inviting me to do this. So thank you very much, and I hope that there'll be some use to you of what I deliver today. I'm going to try and share my slides, and I hope it works. It's always a challenge, it seems to me. Now it says trying to. Oh dear. Just give me a moment, please. Got it. Thank you. I hope that begins to come through.
Not yet.
Yes, Prof. Yes. Can we share the?
I think it's coming through now. It's just give it a second.
It's coming through.
So is that clear to you? And
yes,
yeah, thank you.
Fine now.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So what I've done today is to try and just give you a sense of the big issues that face higher education in South Africa, and there are many of them. And it would seem to me, at least, that that we should have sort of an ongoing conversation, just about what the big challenges are, if you like. And I think the one thing that came out of COVID-19, was simply the fact that we discovered that the only way that we could end the academic year in 2020 and 2021 was to create partnerships. And I want to just emphasize that those partnerships were, first of all, partnerships between the universities working together, but also partnerships between the universities and government, universities and other statutory structures like the CSIR and so on, but also partnerships with the private sector, because had we not had really significant engagement with various sectors of the private economy, and in particular, of course, the mobile network operators, it simply would not have been possible for us to complete the academic year. So, so I think that, if there's one thing that we've learned from the pandemic, it's this idea that we should begin to work closely together, in terms of what's good for our society, if you like. So just to say very, a very broad statement, the higher education sector comprises 26 public universities. And, one might wonder, just why is it that, that societies create universities and sustain universities? And it's because they are seen to be important for the functioning of, what we have in South Africa, for instance, which is a very multi-layered, complex democracy and a very complex economy. And universities are deemed to be important for a proper functioning of those democracies and economies. And I think that, I'll return to this issue a little later on, because it also provides us with a basis to begin to think about how universities relate to societies. Universities are knowledge-intensive institutions. They're expected to do research. They're expected to teach. Their entire kind of business is around knowledge, if you like, and it's critical, I think, to understand that they are special knowledge-intensive institutions. They are not like the CSIRs. They are not like CERN in Geneva. The very big particle accelerator center there. They are not like think tanks and so on. And they're special because they have students, and that is what distinguishes universities from other knowledge-intensive institutions. And so students are very much the core of the business of universities. They form, what the core purpose of universities is, if you like. Universities are, the entire governance systems and so on are predicated on two things: institutional autonomy and academic freedom. But these are not just simply carte blanche kind of favors given to universities. The universities are strongly accountable. They are required to account to society. They're required to account to government, to the Auditor General, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there's quite a lot of leeway for state steering, and especially in a system like ours, where we have, financial constraints. State steering can be very powerful, if you like. So I think what I'm saying is that institutional autonomy and academic freedom aren't just kind of, completely unhinged, if you like, from the rest of the system, if you like, and that accountability is required and state steering is very much on the cards. That happens, in fact. Yeah. And we can talk about some examples of state steering and accountability later on. Just some statistics very broadly. We have more than 1.2 million students. That has more than doubled since 1994. About 20% of those students are in what we refer to as the private institutions of higher learning. So, about 200,000 students now in that sector, and just over 1 million in the public sector. First-time entrance students in the public sector is about 210,000, and this was meant to grow at about 1.2% per annum, but that hasn't happened, and we can talk about that later, why that hasn't happened. But the entire post-school education and training sector has capacity, if you like, to take in 400,000 new students every year. So it's a large system. It's a big system, if you like. And I should just mention also that if one looks at the in higher education, at least, the male to female ratio is about 40% to 60%. In my personal view, I know this is not a very popular idea. In my personal view, we have to start worrying about what's happening to the boys. I'm not sure, I don't think any of us knows exactly what's happening there, but it is an important issue, I think. And I think that I should also just mention that if you look at the throughput rates, if you look at the graduating classes, that ratio shifts even more towards women. So it's something that we have to begin to pay attention to, it seems to me. And the sector produces, the higher education, the public sector at least, produces about 210,000 higher education graduates every year. And of course, what that means is that there are 210,000 graduates coming into the labor market every year. And we can talk about the absorption. I'll talk about that a little later on. Here's an important point and a critical point. The average time of completion of a 3-year degree is about 4.7 years. And of course, that's very concerning, because it means that, that there's a high level of inefficiency, a high level of wastage, if you like. And I should just also mention that the throughput rates are not as high as we would like, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Just to give you a little bit of a little bit of sort of sense of the scale of the higher education sector, if you like, as an industry. If one looks at this graph, and I'm sure it's not very clear to you, but if one looks at this graph, I hope you can see my my cursor. Do you see it? Yeah. Okay. So what one sees, in fact, if you look at the gross value added to the economy, you see that higher education is very much at the same level as gold mining, right? And higher, in fact, than beverages and tobacco, higher than wood and pulp and wood and so on. So it's a very significant industry, if you like, and in terms of the gross value add, it's in the region of, well, in excess of 50 billion rand. These are 2018 figures. And in the left bottom corner, you see a little statement there which says that the economic impact of universities is estimated to be 511 billion in 2018. We did a major study which but we are very concerned, in the study about assumptions that are made, and so we are working through those assumptions with a fine tooth comb just to try and work out what the levels of uncertainty are in those numbers, if you like. So, but this is, of course, a very significant contribution to the economy. Even if it's half of that, it's still a significant contribution. And my personal sense is that actually it's higher than the 511 billion. But when that study is completed, we'll make it public and you'll see those numbers more clearly. So let's just ask ourselves what's happening in the sector, right? Clearly, there are funding challenges, and the subsidy increase between 2020 to 2021 to 21 to 22 is less than 1%. So now that's very concerning, of course, and we are deeply concerned about this not becoming a trend, if you like. But at the same time, we understand that the economy has taken a severe knock with COVID, and what we are constantly trying to put forward to government and so on is that they have to think of education not as an expenditure item, but as an investment item, to think about it as something that the country needs as we navigate this very difficult moment. And we can talk about that a little bit. The subsidy increase per FTE has been kind of 0% over the last 10 to 15 years. It's just been fluctuating up and down around the zero mark. And that's very disconcerting, of course. And the higher education subsidy per GDP is at about 0.65%. It was, the Hare Commission, after the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall campaigns, the Hare Commission recommended that it should be taken up to 1% of GDP, but that hasn't happened, unfortunately. And by the way, it's way, way less than other societies where in the USA it's 2%. No, it's not. USA is not a good example, of course, but if one takes many of our fellow nations on our continent, the figure is much higher, in the region of 2 to 3%. So it's a deeply concerning set of numbers here, if you like, in terms of funding challenges. The student debt is estimated at about 16 billion rand. This is an ongoing challenge. And clearly the new student funding system has made a big difference. But what it hasn't done, of course, is provide us with a clear path, if you like, to addressing the challenges of what we refer to as the missing middle, that group of students that don't qualify for the financial aid system and who can't afford to be at university anyway. And I'm going to come back to these things, but that there's a challenge. There's a multiple kind of set of challenges that are coming at us. We are seeing a regulatory framework for the setting of fees, for fee increases. That's on its way. It will be legislated probably this year or early next year. There are cuts in research funding through the NRF. There are unfavorable rand-dollar exchange rate, and there's a lot of instability in international donor funding with all the big geopolitical issues that are going on. And what we are seeing in other parts of the world is that there's a decline in demand for higher education, largely because of the challenges of employment of graduates. And in the US, that decline has been going on for the last 10 years or so. And we are seeing this in other parts of the world as well. And COVID-19, of course, has had its own impact on this. And I think that the critical issue for us is just to understand how changes in the labor market are going to have an impact on the core functions of universities, if you like. And of course, as I mentioned, there's a whole lot of demand-supply dynamics that have to be taken into account. And if we have some time later on, perhaps we can talk about that a little bit. And of course, the graduate employment is the critical issue for the universities. In 2015, 2016, when the last big study was done, the unemployment rate of graduates was in the region of about 6.2%. We are now repeating that study, and largely because we are terrified, in fact, that unemployment rate has grown significantly. And we'll make that public when that figure is available. Just some other things. We have fewer universities in crisis. It might not seem like that, but it's true. We have a gradual but definite improvement in throughput rates. At the moment, the throughput rate, the number of students who graduate is around 60%, which is way too low. But there has been, over the last 5-6 years, there's been a gradual improvement in throughput rates. There's definitely an improvement in the scale and shape of technology use, and in particular, of course, after COVID-19. And by the way, when we think about technology use, we have to remind ourselves it's not just about using technology for remote learning and so on, for online learning, but it's also, and perhaps most interestingly, it's about the use of technology in research and the use of technology, the new digital technologies in administration. There's been a significant increase in PhD output, but we think that this is flattening out. But it takes time for this trend to emerge because of because it takes 3 years, for a minimum of 3 years for PhD to graduate. So we are watching that very closely. There are huge exercises in curriculum renewal, and in particular following on Rhodes Must Fall. And then lots of work going on in the world of work articulation, so trying to understand how to link industry with universities, trying to understand how to create conversations there. And then finally, on this slide, universities as anchor institutions. This is one of my pet topics, which gets universities to understand that they are located in context, they are in a context, and that they have to play a role in that context, that they can't be just global institutions, but they have to see themselves as being a part of that local context and contributing to it. So what's keeping us awake at night, right? So the first one clearly is student funding. The DHET bursaries now, which is administered by NSFAS, is great, and it kind of really provides secure tuition fees for a significant number of students in our system. And as I mentioned earlier, it will have an impact on student debt, which is very good. But at the same time, we are deeply concerned about the sustainability of that model, simply because every year we discover that NSFAS has announces significant shortfalls, 10 billion, 5 billion, and so on. And the main concern for us is that that instability in funding has an impact on the rest of the university budget, because money is taken out of the subsidy system, for example, to put into the funding system, student funding system. That's a completely kind of illogical, because at a time when you should be building the capacity of universities to take in students, you are reducing the funding to universities. So that makes no sense at all. And as I mentioned, we have no system for missing middle students. There's a lot of work going on, but we don't have this. And the THT bursaries come at a cost, right? I mean, the cost is that we have this regulation of tuition fee increases, fully understandable, by the way. So I'm not, complaining about it, but at the same time, it has implications for the funding of universities, and then the long-term impact on subsidy levels, as I mentioned earlier. So as I've given these figures before, the regulation of tuition fees is important, as I mentioned, but what we have had over the last 6 years is that the increase in tuition fees has been fixed at CPI, even though every year we do a study called HEPI, the Higher Education Price Index, where we kind of look at all the key expenditure drivers in the higher education sector, and we calculate the HEPI, and the HEPI is the higher education price index runs at about 1.8% higher than CPI, and so that's a concern to us, that if we fix the tuition fees at a certain level and the subsidy at a certain level, but actually the cost of running the universities is increasing at a slightly higher rate, that can only lead to kind of pressures down the line. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but just to say that research funding is under severe pressure. Again, it's sitting at around 0.69 of GDP. A target was set by our government of 1.5% of GDP. That was some years ago, but we just made no progress. In fact, you can see that between 2015 and 2019, there was a significant decline. And by the way, if one, perhaps the most important challenge we face is we're seeing a reduction in the contribution of the private sector into what is called GERD. GERD stands for the gross expenditure on R&D, and this is very concerning, because what it means is that for the first time about 3 or 4 years ago, the public sector funding for research overtook the private sector funding for research. That's deeply concerning, because what it means is that the demand side for R&D from the university sector, that is going into decline. And that has severe long-term implications for the innovation system, if you like. There's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's offshoring of R&D into the private sector, offshoring in the private sector. We heard about the big stories around Sasol, for example, and various others. But so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. If there are questions, I'll be happy to take them. Postgraduate funding I'll just say, is a real crisis. We just don't have a decent model for postgraduate funding. I won't spend a lot of time on this either, just to say that student accommodation is a major issue for us. It's not an issue, it's an important aspect of the functioning of universities. And and urban universities can depend on accommodation being provided for students by the local economy, if you like. But once you go into our rural rural universities, then that picture changes dramatically. And there's this. I'll just mention that this is something that we have to pay much more attention to. Yeah, the universities, of course, are not, the sole kind of entities in the post-school education and training sector. They are part of a much larger system. And interestingly, the long-term sustainability of the university system needs a properly functioning PSET system. And the post-school education and training system. If that entire system is not functioning, then the long-term sustainability of universities is going to be threatened. And what's in that system? So, of course, there are the TVT colleges, there's the community education and training colleges, there's the DHET, the CHE, the CETAs, and so on. The professional bodies have to be included in there as well. So it's a large system, and of course you have to also include NSFAS in there. NSFAS is also a part of the PSET system, if you like. And what this means basically is that all these different parts have to work together, and they have to work kind of in synchrony with each other, that it's not enough just for them to work. So, for example, we had grave difficulties with accreditation processes. We continue to have grave difficulties with the accreditation process. But so the big question is, just how do we make the system work better? We can have a long discussion about the CETAs and universities and how we can get those to work much better together. And one of the big challenges we have is in terms of the Department of Higher Education and Training is its continuity and capacity and so on. And there are deep questions about that there. So this is a challenge for us, if you like. I mentioned this before, that universities are really owned by society, right? And there's a constant need for us to build the social ownership of our universities. We are not in a very good place in terms of social ownership of our universities. And when we have time, if we have time later, and if there's a question around this, I'll be happy to kind of spend more time talking about this. So just to say that we should be really thinking quite hard about how to continue to build the social ownership of our universities. And let me make just 2 points now. The one is that we must think about this not just in terms of promoting the universities more and so on, but rather to think about how important universities can be to addressing the big challenges facing our society. Here's probably the biggest challenge we face, which is the next generation of academics. We have an aging professoriate. We have many, many young academics coming through the system. We are concerned about the fact that they are not yet kind of developing into the research heroes, if you like, of our system. But that's happening slowly. We are concerned about the fact that there are major risks associated with recruitment, selection, and retention. We are also deeply aware of the international threat, because universities around the world are not like us. If they see a bright young person somewhere, they just simply snap at those people and take them. We are in a very different position. We kind of seem to want to keep people away from our country with our laws. So that's something which we have to pay attention to, that we are losing lots and lots of young people to international threats. And we have to understand that the issue is not just about salary levels, and of course it is about salary levels too, but it is really about the nature of the conditions of work at our universities. In terms of technology, I've spoken about this already, but just to say that there's a lot of work going on in this area. Cybersecurity is clearly a major challenge for us, and I think that one of the really big challenges for us is to understand what the impact of the labor market is going to be, the impact of the technology on the labor market, and what the implications of that is on the work of universities. And that's something that we are paying a lot of attention to at the moment. And and just to say that universities all have some kind of activities going on in these areas, but it does seem to me that there's a need for us to think about how universities as a sector can address the grand challenges facing our societies. And by the way, it's not just South African society, but global society, global humanity, if you like. Yeah? And clearly it's global warming and climate change, the sustainable use of resources, the demographic trajectory of our continent. I mean, I don't know whether, I'm sure you know this already, but let me just mention that it's estimated that by 2030, 25% of the world's population will reside on our continent. And by 2050, that figure rises to 45%. Of course, there's a whole lot of assumptions there, but that's what the modeling says at the moment, if you like. And then the big question is, just what are the challenges around that? Of course, the issues around geopolitics really kind of has an impact on us, and we can talk about that if we have some time a little later on. Of course, the whole issue of the process of othering, internal and external xenophobia and so on, that's something which we have to be deeply worried about. And then, of course, in our country, we just have to be deeply concerned about financial and non-financial corruption. And I think that the biggest challenge we face, the biggest challenge, in addition to health security, the biggest challenge we face is basic education. That our basic education system is simply failing us at the moment, and that we have to address it. Mr. Bokota, I'll stop there. I hope that was useful. And just to say thank you so much for inviting me. And if there are some questions, I'd be happy to take them. I may not have all the answers, but I'll try. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bawa. That was a very insightful presentation. I started writing notes. There was just too many points that I thought we can engage on a bit further. But I would like to, Desiree, if you can assist with just checking if there's any questions or comments from anyone else in the chat so that we can engage a little bit further. While Desiree is assisting with that, you mentioned on the last slide that one of the biggest challenges is basic education. Currently, what role, not only perhaps from the university's perspective primarily, and then just the whole sector in general, what role are you currently playing to assist with bridging that gap? Because I think more often than not, a lot of students do not make it to grade 12 to then make it on to the universities. So what can be done? Not only what can be done there?
Yeah, so let me just say, of course, universities train the teachers, right? So the universities must be somewhat complicit, like, what's going on, in the basic education system. So I say that partly with tongue in cheek, but we have to ask these hard questions, right? Yeah, I think that there's a need for us to take a step back, on basic education. I mean, when we came to 1994, what we did was we unified all the systems. We kind of, we have created new laws which required young people to be at school, etc., etc., etc. A lot of very powerful legislation and policies and so on were put in place. However, I think that, there are 2 or 3 examples that I would like to share with you, that kind of really raise a question as to whether we really understand what we want from our basic education system. So we've known for years now that there's this tremendous wastage of young talent, in the schooling system with the dropout rates and so on. But we've done next to nothing to address that, We've done absolutely minimal amount to try and ensure that we kind of address that. So what we've done is we've tried to kind of introduce new curricula. I was invited to a discussion where a group went to Cuba and read about and learned about the basic schooling there, and then came here. Mathematics they were talking about, came here and were very enthusiastic and so on, so we just kind of flounder, if you like, in this area. So let me give you 2 examples, right? The one is in the Verwoerdian period, in the apartheid period, Verwoerd kind of made the statement that young black people should not be studying mathematics. Why do they need it, right? That's like the most colonial kind of construct you can imagine.
Yeah.
Actually, very little has changed between 1994 and now in that respect. What we should have done is we should have said that every South African will study mathematics up to grade 12. That's what we should have said. And we should have done whatever it takes to do that, to achieve that. Now, I'm not saying this because, I'm a mathematician. I'm not saying that for that reason. I'm saying it because, having a population that studies mathematics does 2 things. It frees us of that colonial legacy, but it does something else. It also kind of raises the bar, if you like, for our young people. It says to young people, we expect you to finish this, this mathematics. We're going to do whatever it takes to help you to do that. But basically what we've done is we've just continued with the Verwoerdian model, if you like, with the Verwoerdian dictum. It's very sad. I mean, I don't know what else to say. By the way, our engineering faculties are simply not getting students with the right kinds of mathematics to come into their faculties. So here's a big challenge, right? The second one is, I visited Japan for the first time a few years ago, and I just so happened that one of my colleagues there, my physics colleagues, has a daughter who was a school teacher. So she was telling me about schooling in there. And I was really fascinated because what occurred to me in the discussions with her, and then she took me to the school, was, it occurred to me in the first 4 years of schooling, there are no examinations. Of course, the students learn, they learn mathematics and everything else, but there's no examinations. The emphasis is on one thing. The emphasis is on character building.
Yeah.
That's the emphasis. So, at the end of the school day, the 6-year-olds and upwards get on the floor and they wipe the floors, they wipe their desks, they put away their books. There's a simple message here. The message is, you use something, you clean up. Nobody's coming behind you. Now, I'm not suggesting we should follow the Japanese, right? But what I'm saying is that they have a very clear idea about what they want to achieve with their basic education system. We don't have that. And I think that we should be saying to our president, please, let's go back and let's have a serious discussion about what we want to achieve with basic education. And then let's make that happen.
Let's make that happen. Yeah. No. Thank you, Prof, for that response. There's a couple of questions that have come through. So the first one is, previously disadvantaged universities remain behind in many aspects. How is this being addressed or influenced at USEF level? Yeah,
so that's a very critical question, a very important question. I want to just begin by saying, that it's true that if you do the comparison, say, between University of Cape Town, University of Zululand, so that you see the disparities. No question about it. And the disparities are massive. On the other hand, I think it's also important to understand that those universities are not where they were in 1994. That there's much more research going on, their throughput rates are much better, and so on and so forth. So there has been progress. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there has been some level of progress, but the disparities are massive. So I'll just mention 3 things. The one is that we are arguing to government and to the university sector, in fact, that what we should do is establish what we call a shared services platform for all 26 universities. So, for example, if we want to have a chemical analytics laboratory, it's very, very expensive to set up. It really doesn't make sense for each university to have its own.
Yeah.
What we should really be doing is saying, well, can we set up one in each region, and decide how to divide up the country into regions, and then allow all 26 universities access to those facilities. Another example would be, each university at the moment procures its own teaching and learning digital platform. And we are arguing that what we should do is we should really build a national digital teaching and learning platform, which is available to all 26 universities. It has a central kind of software building department, etc., etc., etc. So, in other words, it's saying, can we look at large projects which really feed into all 26 universities rather than to let each university do its own thing. And there are many other examples like that we are working on at the moment.
How are those arguments, sorry, Prof, how are the arguments coming along? So how far are you?
So the universities are sort of on track to take this route. But the scale of this program is so large that it really depends on government coming in. And we've raised this with the minister, and we're hoping, in fact, that he would make this kind of a flagship kind of project, if you like, of the government. The second example is we're also saying that we need dedicated funding to foster the development of partnerships between our different universities. I'll give you one statistic which is quite diabolical, right? So about 50% of our research output is done in partnership with other universities, but those other universities are outside South Africa. If you look at partnerships between South African universities internally, it's like next to zero. So we are saying that there's a need for a much stronger kind of incentives, if you like, for universities to work with each other. So the one way to do that is to have incentive funding, which can only be accessed if there's a partnership between, an HDI and an HAI. So in other words, saying, we really need to kind of foster this kind of development. Now, the universities are also very keen on this. So, now having said all of that, I don't think that we're going to get away from the need for, I don't know what to call it, but dedicated funding, if you like, to go to the universities which are struggling. That there really does need to be significant amount of investment in terms of infrastructure and so on. And we've just had two new universities built. There's a third one being considered at Ekurhuleni. I think the one question we have to ask ourselves is, are we able to kind of really ensure that the other universities that are struggling aren't just going to get weaker and weaker and weaker as the funding crisis improves? So I think what I'm saying is that the government has to find a way of supporting, in particular, infrastructure development at the other universities here.
Yeah, no, thanks, Prof. Another question which directly, in fact, talks to the funding issue is from Oba. It is in relation to the allocation of funding. So in your view, is that appropriate between SITAs and all the different institutions at post-learning? Yeah.
Yeah, so at the moment, what we have is a funding formula, right? That kind of so there's an allocation from Treasury that comes to DHET, and then there's a funding formula. The funding formula basically works on the number of students that we have. So of course the university that gets the largest, the largest kind of bunch of funding is UNISA, because it has over 300,000 students, right?
Yeah.
And then of course, science students qualify, are funded at a slightly higher level than humanities students because they need laboratories and so on and so forth. So that's the way that system works. Yeah, my take is that system works okay, but there really is a challenge for me, at least, in terms of trying to understand how to articulate, if you like, the money that resides, for example, in the SITAs and the universities. And now, there isn't any kind of significant conversation going on yet between, that money and the money in universities. Now, I'm not suggesting that there aren't partnerships, by the way, between SITAs and universities. They are, but it's, they're not necessarily strategic, if you like, in the way in which that funding is utilized. So that's a conversation that still needs to be had, it seems to me. And just to complete, my sentiments on that, as the nature of the work of universities changes. So, for example, it seems to me that there's, without question, that there are going to be new forms of credentialing in the next 5-6 years. There's a kind of mythology, right? Although it's a nice mythology and one that we should listen to, that if somebody applies for a job at Google, that you're not asked, just what qualifications do you have? What you are asked is, what can you do? Like, what are your skills and so on. So that's clearly going to be a very important shift in the university terrain. And it seems to me, at least, that one of the challenges we face then is to understand how to fund that, because it will really be working with people who are currently in labor, in work, and getting them kind of upskilled and so on. So that might be an area for a massive collaboration, if you like.
Yeah. Great, thanks. So another one, we'll take one more question. And I know everyone, there's just quite a bit there's quite a bit that everyone would like to engage with the Prof on. We will arrange, we'll have a lot more of these sessions in the near future. So whatever questions are not addressed today, we will try set up another session to address them. We'll take one more from Moses Mandua. It's the question is, may you please share some of your thoughts around the issue of third stream income and how this is being addressed at USAF level?
Okay, so that's an interesting point, right? Yeah, so third stream funding, I would describe it as in terms of three separate categories, if you like. The one form of third stream funding is sort of investments that universities have money that universities have that they invest and they earn interest on that and so on. And of course, the older traditional universities have much more in that way than the new universities. When I say new universities, the HDIs and so on. So for those universities like the Pretoria, University Cape Town, etc., that's a significant part of third stream income where money is invested and money comes in. Okay, there's a second form, which is where universities engage in business enterprises, right? So universities, some universities own hotels which they run, others kind of provide services of various kinds and so on. And of course, a lot of that really depends on kind of having the right kind of program mix. So for example, if you have a medical school, that's very good because that might allow you to kind of offer services in the health terrain. At Durban University of Technology, where I was, there was a clinic that was open to the public. It didn't make much money, but because it was really serving the public and providing training opportunities for students. But that one can potentially think of that as a money-generating operation. Another example will be where universities partner with Cisco, for example, or with Microsoft to offer courses, masterclass courses, and that's a form of income. So there's all of that kind of activity, sort of business-related activities, if you like. And one can be quite imaginative about what can be achieved there. The problem, of course, is that you better make sure that you don't run at a loss, because that has significant implications then for a whole range of governance issues and so on. The third kind of income is really dependent on your research enterprise, and it really depends on just how well established your research enterprise. Now, I'm sure you're getting my drift, right? The drift is that the established universities, the historically white universities, are in a far better position than the others are in terms of achieving higher levels of third stream income. And I think that, one of the things that I've been arguing, and I think we should all be arguing, is that there is a need, it seems to me, for us to really convince provincial government and local government to work much more closely with the universities than to work to bring in consultants from outside, and to really build strong, sustained relationships with local universities as a way of sort of ensuring that the universities become more connected with the challenges being faced at the local level, but also for that to become an income-generating sort of activities for the local universities. So that that's the kind of thinking I think we have to move towards. But let me just complete with one last statement about third stream income, and that is that we are a public higher education system, and what that means is that we really must be careful not to imagine that our universities can become self-sufficient on the basis of third stream income. Because what third stream income does is that it shifts the core purpose of universities, right? It shifts the purpose of universities towards business kind of activities and so on. We don't want that to become the dominant kind of mode of operation, if you like. You really want universities to focus on teaching and research. That's their core activities. So it's important, I think, for us to think about third stream income not as a way of universities becoming sustainable, if you like. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Bawa, for your time. Thank you. We will now move on to the next session. I would like to invite my colleague Thabo and Setabile to join us. So for the next session of the webinar, we are going to be looking a lot more on some of the items, just diving in some of the items that have already been mentioned by Professor Bawa. For example, the third stream income, if you already do have that in place, what are the governing structures that you have in place to ensure that everything is done properly and all the laws are appropriately followed? We have a couple of experts with us today. We have first up Thabo, who leads higher education sector industry within GT. Thabo is an experienced audit partner. He is going to share with us some of his experiences from the past 2 years and just his vision of view going forward. We will also hear from Setabile. Setabile is also a partner in internal audit. She will share from her own experiences some of the challenges and what we have done to assist some of our clients in the sector. After Setabile, we will hear from Musi, who is going to talk a bit more about VAT-related matters. We will then hear from Deboho, who is going to talk about digitalization, and we'll hear from Kuda, who is going to cover cybersecurity-related matters. Thabo?
Thank you so much, Kanisa, and good morning, everyone. So my presentation is purely just to, on a high level, just to bring together the whole education sector and highlight some of the challenges that we have observed in the last 2 years and what we are seeing going forward. And obviously, some of the points that have been raised by Prof. Bawa are actually some of the points that I was going to cover, but I'll just go deeper in terms of some of the areas that we feel are critical for the institutions and that they need to be looked at, and also, more importantly, be planned for so that we don't find ourselves in situations where we are behind in terms of addressing some of the risks that institutions face. So on a nutshell, I think what is key, what we're sharing on the screen here, is just to give a picture of this education sector as a whole. And Prof. Bawa did touch a bit on it. And when you see it, you have the public institutions and the private colleges. In terms of the numbers, if you have to go to the numbers, the public institutions are about 85 public institutions, which is covered by universities, TVET, and community training education. Then you have private universities and colleges, and that sector is actually growing bigger. We have about 258 private universities and colleges made up of 182 registered universities, private universities, and 106 private colleges. So that mix just kind of indicates or shows you in terms of the makeup of the market, and that there is actually quite a growing number of private sector participating in higher education, and that are expected to grow. And that comes in relation to some of the challenges that Prof. Bawa has explained in terms of our education system, and that's why we see the sector growing even bigger. And more importantly, I think when you look at the sector and the importance of the sector in relation to the country, we look at the NDP for target for 2030. The majority of those indicators that are included in the National Development Plan are going to be achieved from this sector. And if the sector does not actually achieve what is set, or doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and the majority of those indicators or targets will not be achieved, and that has a bigger impact in the overall system. I mean, the whole economy, because this sector effectively feeds up across all sectors that are operating in the economy, from your entrepreneurial to your corporate people and academics as well. So what we have seen, and unfortunately, is what it becomes a kind of a punishment for this higher education, is that some of the social challenges that have not been addressed by the government to some extent, then they come through at these institutions, and they are vocalized at this level. So the inequalities that we are seeing at some of the previously disadvantaged institutions, they become more prevalent at this stage, and they become more known at this level in terms of funding for studies, accommodation. When COVID came through, you then have a bigger challenge of how do they then provide the learning and teaching in a remote way that allows the academic year to be saved, and most importantly, allows the institution to continue ensuring that there's a throughput in the market that is required in terms of the market demand for labor. But generally what we see is that the sector by itself is a very resilient sector in the sense that it survives many challenges, whether it's economic challenges, political challenges. It's most cases very resilient. But when we go deeper in terms of understanding globalization-wise, what are we seeing within South Africa? So a number of our student population is also coming from our neighboring countries, foreign students, and that makes about 80,000. That was in 2020. So that is quite a significant number, and we expect, with obviously the changes in technology and the accessibility of being able to learn in your own country, that number will eventually grow to become a significant proportion. And similarly, the private colleges will also expect them that we will see more of those coming through into the country to offer some of the training or some of the qualifications which will allow our graduates to then become competitive in the labor market. So those are some of the developments we're seeing. So the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, I think, brought quite, or at least maybe highlighted some of the deficiencies within the system. And one of those is around the spending on IT infrastructure and the level of which institutions are able to plan for continuity in the event that there's a disruption, a fiscal disruption to the education system. And that was evident. I mean, on average, we looked at the numbers for 2020 on a budget, on an expenditure of about 5.6 billion. Approximately 62% of that was more on fiscal infrastructure in terms of the buildings and residential accommodation for students, and only about 12% of that was going to IT infrastructure. And that limited investment around IT infrastructure obviously puts most of the historically disadvantaged universities to be a bit behind, and that's where we then saw a lot of challenges in terms of learning when the COVID outbreak happened in 2020. So I think Prof touched a lot around your common challenges. I will not go deeper in terms of funding. And then those are some of the things that we've observed as well from our side when we were busy in terms of the investment. Then from the operational side, and that's where I think from the panel that we have on the call, they will go deeper to just outline some of the solutions that we have within the institution that can allow the universities and the TVET colleges and CT colleges to actually manage some of the risks that exist and be able to respond to them and probably even collaborate better, as Prof has highlighted. From a compliance point, the issues of tax, in particular VAT, where there are a number of revenue streams or number of strategies that the institutions are going to take, and that has different implications. And Umbuso will touch a bit deeper on those aspects in terms of what are those risks and what are the things that needs to be considered in relation to venturing or in relation to some of the revenue streams that are coming through. The other element also touched on a bit by Prof Bawa is also on cyber risk, and obviously with the increased hybrid learning, if I may call it, way, we see that they created an opportunity for cyber attacks, and we have seen already in the country some of the institutions where they were attacked by cyber, and we probably this will also grow to the universities, even more numbers, and also to TVET, which is a sector which is a bit worrying because there's a bit behind around their IT infrastructure investment and IT competencies. So those are some of the areas that we see as a challenge. And then Deborah will touch on digitalization and also CUDA on cybersecurity. So I'll leave it there, and I think most of these items will be covered in detail by my colleagues. Thanks, Kanisa. I'll hand over to Stabile to then just touch a bit on their view from internal audit perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Thabo. So whilst Stabile is preparing to come on board, just have one question for you. So Professor Bawa shares that there is a decrease in funding from private sector for research. We often hear a private sector, including, I guess, firms like ours, where there is a complaint about the lack of either skilled resources or skilled staff coming out of university, or a gap that we see that may exist between what the university graduates are able to do and what the work environment requires them to do. What role can institutions like our institution play to bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And Prof. Bawa touched on it, that when you look at institutions like Google in terms of the labor force, what they expect from graduates, somebody who is ready to do some things. And that means a bit of more collaboration. And that's where the universities need to be closer to the labor market and identify, as you're providing for whatever modules, for whatever course, already know what sector is actually going to be employing or recruiting those students, and work closer in terms of practical training, winter vacation, where they come through some of case study type of module that will help the students to then kind of practicalize their theory and be ready for the labor market. So those are some of the initiatives that need to go. But primarily, I think business must be closer to universities to be able to then assist, or at least be clear in terms of expectation, because I mean we are the receiving we are receiving the product, and if we don't drive the input of that output, we'll then have a challenge in the future. Thanks.
No, certainly. Sitabile?
Thanks, Kanyisa and Thabo. I think the previous speakers have already touched on the transformation journey that's happening in the universities. I just want to bring in the aspect from an IT point of view. So as we are aware, when transformation occurs, IT is often, considered to be a tool to enable that transformation to happen. So we've seen that journey has been started in terms of the online learning, making sure that, courses are delivered online. I just want to share a few things that were observed with the COVID pandemic. This is now more on the assessment side, the assessment, the examinations being undertaken during the COVID pandemic. So in this regard, I think little progress had been made in terms of making sure that institutions are able to conduct exams online. And what we found is that where institutions had already embarked on a journey of implementing some form of IT governance, like for instance, putting IT steering committee structures in place, the journey in terms of making sure that examinations can be done online was kind of smoother compared to universities where there were no structures for IT governance. For instance, your IT steering committees and maybe IT project steering committees that would help in terms of making sure that those platforms that were needed during COVID could be implemented effectively. So in some instances, we found that universities just, where there was no guidance, like for instance, from an IT steering committee perspective, the selection of platforms was just left to the faculties, to decide on which platform could be used for, for the assessment. And this posed a number of risks, in the examination process. One, the process itself had not been outlined in terms of how is it going to unfold from beginning to the end, because as you can be aware, it's different when the examinations are run online as opposed to, when students are sitting in a location where, there is proper invigilation and everybody can be seen in terms of what they are doing during the exam. So that became a challenge, and there were kind of many gaps in terms of, IT controls. Just to mention one example for a control that we found that was key, though it looks small, like the starting of the examination, and when the examination is supposed to end. So some of the tools that we used to run the online assessments, that control wasn't there. So you would find that some students would have taken 3 hours to write the same paper, whereas others ended up getting more than the 3 hours. So those are the kind of challenges that I thought we can just highlight from an IT perspective. Now, when you look at the challenges that occurred during COVID, one then tends to think that isn't it time for internal audit to pick up, their consulting cap and kind of provide the necessary guidance to these institutions of higher learning in terms of implementing the appropriate controls as the universities are transforming to use more technology in delivering, the online learning and also in making the assessment. We all understand that internal audit can actually play a consulting role. And from what we have seen, I think what's required is we need to strengthen controls right from the IT governance side of things, as well as IT management. We touched on the fact that, some institutions didn't have IT steering committees at that time, of which then it was difficult to say who then takes responsibility for what. We need a system here and we need it fast. Exams need to be written today, not tomorrow. So what do we do? What processes do we follow, in terms of making sure that there's a system, exams are written and students don't miss an academic year? So those gaps can be closed really, through the leadership from the internal audit part, making sure that those necessary controls are actually implemented. This also goes for IT management controls, not only the IT governance side, like for instance, the continuity aspect, which also does not really border on just having an IT disaster recovery plan or whatever, but maybe just implementing the entire BCM program to make sure that there is proper continuity should there be a need, that arises from a disaster perspective. That is basically the observations from an IT controls perspective. And I would hand back to Kanyisa.
Great. Thank you so much, Stabile, for that. That was quite, well, that was quite a bit, right? It got me thinking. From a lot of the universities, like you indicated, had to introduce all of these IT controls to deal specifically with the issue of COVID. We now post-COVID. The whole control environment, does it, from your experience, did it take into account what happens after when students now, at least the greater numbers are back in class? Are those systems still in use? Would that process form part of any internal audit process, maybe especially on the consulting side, to say, if you're bringing in some new solutions to deal with a specific issue, does that look post? What happens when you've dealt with the issue?
So because this is a transformation journey for these institutions, even post-COVID, there will still be a need to still have, like for instance, online assessments. And we need to also bear in mind that COVID is kind of past, but nobody knows what else is coming. So I think the readiness in terms of making sure that we are ahead of the game as far as technology is concerned, when the need arises, we are able to rely on technology to get things going. It's still there. So it's important that there is a conscious decisions that gets made to make sure that we still consider strengthening the technology side of things, and more importantly, making sure that the technology that we're using has the appropriate controls in place, because we will still need it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Stabile. So I will just encourage everyone again to post comments and questions. Stabile and Thabo are going to be part of the call when we've heard from everyone, and we'll bring them back on to answer or engage further on any of your own individual experiences based on what they've shared. While Mbusi is coming on board, one of the most cost-effective ways of managing tax risks is in first doing it through internal audit, and we don't see enough of that in the at least higher education sector. So how this would be typically done in other sectors, you have a very detailed tax risk policy, and that can also be accompanied by a detailed and up-to-date tax register. In the tax risk policy, what one would hope to find for a higher education institution would be first looking at the cross-border activity. Pre the COVID era, there always has been a bit of cross-border activity. I think Professor Bawa spoke a bit on that as well, where you have got partnerships with South African universities, partnering with foreign universities. You may also have South African universities that employ foreign nationals and bring them on board. Either they come to South Africa or they work for the institutions while they are abroad, but delivering services or doing research on behalf of the South African institution. There was quite a significant increase of that activity during COVID, and I think we're seeing that continue because now people can see that they do not need to leave their comfort zone. They don't need to travel and leave their countries. They can do some work for you while they are based in their own country. That brings about a couple of issues or questions from a tax perspective. The first one is, if you have a professor or researcher that is doing some work for you anywhere else in the world, maybe UK, Germany, Kenya, does that create a risk for you to register in that country, for at least from a tax perspective? If you created what we would call a permanent establishment, and on whatever fees you're paying to such individuals, are you withholding the appropriate taxes? Should you be withholding the taxes, or should that be done by the government wherever they are situated? So I think it will be great to see a lot more of this detailed policies, the risk policy that just sets out what should be done by any institution that is considering doing any work that may be either outside of their ordinary work or something, again, that you do quite regularly, but it does come with all of those considerations. Who should do what? Should you bring in a tax consultant to review? Do you get a consultant in the country where you are partnering with someone to look at the tax implications in that country? In this example, that would be tax implications for you in the UK, tax implications for you in Kenya. And there is, again, something else that was debated a little bit earlier, that was looking at other streams of income to fund the activities of universities. Again, if you had a detailed risk policy there, ideally one would hope to see a whole process that says, what happens if you are thinking of entering into a joint venture, set up a subsidiary, or enter in any other activity that will help you generate additional income for your core business? If you house those in a different vehicle, what are the tax implications? Should you be registering a company? Is it subject to normal tax? Is it exempt? If it is exempt, what are the terms and conditions that are associated with that exemption? So one of the key things that can trip many of exempt institutions out of exemption is if you have what would be considered a connected party. That would be a director that is an employee or significant influencer from the core business of the university that is now a director in such an institution. If you're paying that person a fee that may be seen not to be market related, you may find yourself in a situation where you no longer exempt. So you must now pay normal taxes. So there is just quite a bit that we believe can be appropriately managed, obviously with meaningful partnerships with advisory units, internal audits, and also collaborations with institutions such as ourselves, because as indicated, we've done quite a bit of advisory and also assisted compliance, where you find that someone did not do the pre-work to say, will I be subjected to tax in the country, and what would that be at? So what we've done in those instances is then do what we all apply for voluntary disclosure, which is something that is not in place in many of our neighboring countries. So if you have had activities of employed people that are either in Kenya or in Zim, you may find that if you want to correct that, you follow quite a different process from the one that we do in South Africa, but our duty officers in those respective countries are happy, and they have assisted us to deal with some issues that are coming from a South African end. On that note, we'll then bring on board Mbusi, who is going to a bit more detail on VAT-related matters. Mbusi, over to you.
Thank you, Kanyisa. Good morning to everybody. In that note, I would like to follow on what you have just spoken about in relation to the control environment that is within the VET on the higher educational sector. Allow me then to say that when I'm speaking about the higher educational sector, I'm speaking about the public universities and private universities, TVET colleges and private colleges. So in my discussion, I will refer to them as institutions in this regard. So currently what is happening within this sector, the institutions, the supply of an educational services is exempt for VAT purposes. Does mean that these institutions, they should not be registered for VAT because they are out of the ambit of the legislation for VAT purposes. But however, as a result of the lack of fundings, the institutions have found themselves in looking for alternative fundings in making sure that they are carrying on their activities. Now, in that regard, that has brought another element because those income streams that are getting, for VAT purposes, they are being analyzed as taxable supplies, and they require certain registration requirement for them. Part system and the control environment in the higher educational sector. Why is that? Because normally that accounting system was was not configured correctly to ensure that it account the value added tax accordingly. As we know that the VAT is a transactional basis, it means that whenever you insert a transaction within the accounting system, you need to analyze exactly what would be the VAT implications. I will just take a couple of the complexity that is brought in within the control environment in the accounting system. Number one will be your apportionment requirement. Secondly will be foreign donor funded project, and I will end up with the imported services. Now, the apportionment requirement, as we know that the public universities, they are part of HISA VAT classical ruling. It means that then they need to apply the certain percentage on a certain expenditure within the accounting system in ensuring that they are apportioning right for the VAT purposes. Now, other expenditure that are inserted in the accounting system is either they are charged with VAT at 100%, and the other one is either they are charged with VAT at 0% or they are totally exempt. Now, you could imagine that the type of the system that you need to have, it needs to trigger, and the person that is involved in capturing these transactions, they need to be well known to say at what percentage do you enter the transactions, because once you miss that, then it means that the financial records and the information submitted to SARS will be incorrect. Now, with donor-funded project, foreign donor-funded project, I heard the prof that is saying that is decreasing. But currently, if you could imagine that when you receive 10 donor-funded projects in your accounting system, for VAT purposes, it does mean that you need to register all these foreign donor-funded projects as an individual project within your system, and you need to manage all the costs that are incurred for each project to ensure that it complies with the VAT legislation. Imagine if you have 10 of these foreign donor-funded projects in your accounting system. How then do you keep track? How do you reinforce each and every cost that is incurred in ensuring that you comply with the VAT laws? So that creates a cumbersome and a burden within the accounting system, a controlling environment to say how do you control these project in ensuring that you comply with the VAT Act. Currently, I know there are talks that there should be one registration number and all the other foreign donor funded projects should be relating to that. but we are still awaiting to say how that will be implemented and how that it will assist in lessening the compliance. Thirdly, let me speak about the imported services. Imported services, this is the expenditure that is incurred by the institutions. Now, these are professional service expenses that are incurred when we require a service of a foreign person to assist us in a revenue that is directed to exempt supplies. As we know, the universities are supplying educational services, which by its nature is defined as exempt supplies. So when you engage in these professional services, then it means that you need to declare the output tax currently as per the VAT laws that are currently registered in South Africa. So how do you keep track of these professional services in your accounting system? Do you have a direct mechanism to say these are local, these are foreign services, professional services? What do you have as a mechanism? Because once you miss that, then it means that you wouldn't be able to declare the output tax, and you will be in compliance with the legislations, and your accounting records, your financials will not also be incorrect. So these dynamics that are embedded within the accounting, the control environment within the accounting system, they need a detailed analysis. They need a detailed person to ensure that, at least a qualified person, to ensure that each and every transaction that is entered into the system, accounting system, is properly analyzed and is transacted correctly, so that the correct financial information is going to be obtained and the correct VAT information is going to be submitted to SARS. So currently in the firm, we have something called a VAT tool, which is a data analytical tool where we analyze where we analyze all the information that is entered into the system and how then that is being transpired in the VAT return. This is the example that we have. As you can see, there are these transactions that have been driven by the VAT codes. I will not gonna be in detail on it, but as it's driven by the VAT codes, our tools is able to extract the information as driven by the codes and analyze properly to say, is it correct or is it not correct? We have few exceptions that we have noted here. What we do is we further diagnose those exceptions to say, by click of a button, what are the source documents that are making these codes being incorrect. So we are quite familiar with the vast data that how do we then interpret it in ensuring that the information submitted to SARS is correct, and the information that is left in the accounting system, because once there is a misstatement in the accounting system, it means your financial records is going to be incorrect as well. So this is our result that we have obtained relating to our data analytical VAT tool. Right, in the next slide, please. Okay, so while I've spoken about the foreign donor-funded project and imported services, one element that we need to talk about ideally is the electronic services, as the impact of the COVID-19 has shown us that we can deal with each other via technology. This has therefore been on an increase in the entire world. Currently in South Africa, with the definition of an electronic services, it does exclude the supply of educational services, which the universities they are applying. Therefore, there shouldn't be a risk that we do have when we have the student from other jurisdictions looking to learn on our side. We had a webinar, I think 3 weeks back, on this subject matter, where in Zimbabwe and Kenya, this is a developing topic. So it means that then there is still a worry for us as universities in South Africa to say, what then if the other jurisdictions, they define electronic services to include the supply of an education services? Then it would have meant that if we do source these students, foreign students, and they learn through the technology to the extent that we qualify for the registration in those jurisdictions. Our universities will be required to register for that, perhaps in Kenya, perhaps in Zimbabwe. So forth and so forth. So that would mean that there is an additional burden of compliance in those countries. Our hope right now is just to say we hope to harmonize the definition of an electronic services, or perhaps we change the regulations within in South Africa to ensure that we are in line with the international standards, because that will really trigger a huge burden in ensuring that we are complying in the foreign jurisdictions. The other one that I'm going to talk about is the student accommodation. I'm not going to go in technical in this, but we heard from Prof and from my colleagues that there is a huge problem about the students supplying the student accommodation. Now, also in the VET Act, there is an alignment where we are saying that that when a university or when an institutions is providing a residential accommodation that is exempt for VAT purposes. But however, when a university is using a private entity to provide the accommodation for VAT purposes, that a private entity will have to charge VAT on the university. Now, university will have to have a burden of putting a cost of on that student accommodation, which is an opportunity cost lost, because that money would have used in certain way needed by the university. So there is a mismatch and alignment currently within the supply of accommodation when then the university is using a private entity. My last point briefly is going to be on the next summary, is to say what then is going to be our global, what is a global trend at the moment. What we know is there is a stringent a method that is applied by the tax authority in relation to compliance and the collection of the refunds. Now, they are introducing e-filings, they are introducing e-invoicing, they are introducing also e-auditing, meaning to say the commissioner will link its system to your accounting system at any point given time to source whatever it sources to ensure that you are fully in compliance. Now, the situation therefore is dire when it finds that you are not compliant, because the commissioner will charge your interest and penalties from ranging from 0% to 20%. So it is really vital for the institutions to ensure that there is a proper controls within its accounting system in accounting for value-added tax, including those, including these highlighted risks that I've spoken about. So let me pause here, Kanyisa, and I'll hear if there will be any questions. But let me hand it over to my colleagues at Teboho in this regard. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mbusi. Teboho, while you're coming on board, Mbusi, you mentioned that with the global electronic impact, there has been an increase, I guess, in universities attracting students outside of South Africa. So from a Kenyan perspective, I think the regulations there, they've indicated they do not consider, while education is exempt in Kenya for VAT purposes, but if that education service is offered by a foreign organization to students who are based in Kenya, then that exemption rule is not applicable, which would mean you then should be registered. So if you did not register before, you were not aware of this requirement, and you now know, what can you do?
the first thing is that will be a better solution is to come forward. In South Africa, we call that a voluntary disclosure that you made a mistake. That's why I said there's a risk that the institutions within the South Africa, they need to manage properly in aligning the definition of of electronic services. Now, if you did not know, we can have our member firm assisting you in ensuring that you voluntarily disclose this information to SARS, so that perhaps you can waive the interest and penalty that may be charged as a result of non-compliance. So this situation is really dire because it has a huge financial implications. So the best answer is just to say let's voluntarily disclose if there is that program that is happening in those jurisdictions.
Thank you, Mbusi. Teboho, over to you.
Thanks, Khanyisa, and good morning, colleagues. So yeah, I'll spend a bit of time talking about digital transformation and data management and analytics within the higher education space. Perhaps a starting point is to think about some of the challenges that the Prof spoke about earlier. So the Prof emphasized quite a number of times that one of the key challenges is around funding. Now, this has a direct impact on the ability of institutions of higher learning to be able to digitally transform. Now, if we take a step back to pre-COVID, there was already a lot of pressure for universities to digitalize some of their processes. So if you take a typical student, how they interact with the world in their normal life is that they use a lot of digital tools. However, to a large extent, many of the university processes were still manual in nature. So that pressure was already there in terms of the need to digitalize. However, what then happened with COVID is that need was accelerated. As Stabile mentioned earlier, this became a challenge because a lot had to be done in a short space of time. In many instances, a lot of the universities didn't necessarily have the experience to carry out those digital transformation programs, with the result that some of them were not necessarily done right and potentially exposed universities to certain risks. So this brings about an important topic about why do we do digital transformation. First of all, we're not doing digital transformation for the sake of it. So we're trying to solve a particular problem, or we're trying to improve a particular process that will make the university better. But in that rush after COVID, there was sometimes just throwing funds at various projects to try to get digitalization done as quickly as possible, with the result that sometimes the benefits were not necessarily realized. So we believe there's some value in the universities looking at these programs and putting in place a proper program management process to be able to manage these technology rollouts. But more importantly, universities should also be looking at how do we decide what projects to focus on? So is there a portfolio of potential projects that we're looking at, and how do we prioritize which ones we should be looking at, considering some of the challenges that we have from a funding perspective. So there's a number of interrelated topics around funding, around the rollout of technology, and around changing some of the potential revenue earners as well from a university perspective. We do understand, however, that digital transformation is not an overnight thing. It's a journey that takes time, and the universities don't always have the time to wait until those projects can be completed. And this is where we've seen the opportunity for universities to then use things like artificial intelligence and data analytics to sort of bridge the gap to get to that state where you fully digitally transformed. So I'll talk about a few examples where we've worked with universities and some of the aspects that we've seen around the various processes. So starting with the revenue process. So the revenue process, and I'm specifically talking about revenue as it relates to students. It can be a highly complex area that is also quite dynamic. So if you imagine this process, students register at the beginning of the year, they pick certain subjects. They may also be part of the accommodation that the university offers, and then at the end of the year, they choose or they qualify to write the exams or not. So all of these aspects have got some revenue impact. Now, some of this may be changing throughout the year, depending on how the student is performing, depending on whether the students continue throughout the year. So there's a process of managing that revenue, those revenue changes, which sometimes the systems in place do not do so well. And this is where we've seen certain universities start employ data analytics to say, let's have a continuous view of how things are changing, so that we ensure that we don't have any leakage from a revenue perspective. Closely linked to the issue of revenues there is the issue of debtors, specifically around student debtors. We all know the challenge that we face as a country in terms of funding, and as Prof mentioned, there's that missing middle that is not necessarily funded from an external perspective, and they need to provide their own funding. Unfortunately, given our economic situation, often these students fall into a situation whereby they cannot complete their studies simply because they cannot afford to pay the existing debt. However, there's instances where you can use things like data analytics and continuous monitoring to be able to predict where some of the students may be potentially getting financial distress and being able to intervene at an earlier stage. And we've seen certain universities use this in a very positive way. And then related to both revenue and data is also the issue of grants. So as you know, grants play an important part in the university space. So let's think about this from two perspectives. So there's specific grants that are meant for certain projects. Some of the challenges that we've seen is that the universities are not always able to match the sources of those funds to the earmarked projects. This can result in funds being misused for not what they were intended for, and in certain instances, they can also open the door to potential fraud. So this is where there's also an opportunity to use data management and analytics to closely match what the funds were intended for and what they're actually being used for. The other side of the grant coin is when you then talk about student funding, specifically around NSFAS. So given the impact or the role of NSFAS in the funding process, it's an institution that universities have to make sure that they work with, even though there may be challenges from an efficiency perspective. So we've seen that a lot of the universities, as well as a number of TVET colleges, struggle with ensuring that they receive the correct amount of funds that are allocated to the right students, and in doing so, they make sure that they don't end up returning some of these funds to NSFAS at the end of the year. So those whole processes are something that you can then use analytics to make sure that you're constantly doing the necessary reconciliations. Supply chain is another area where we've seen universities using the use of data in terms of understanding the process to say, is the process followed correctly, and it feeds into some of the internal audit processes that Stabile spoke to at the beginning. And then the issue of payroll is also an important one for universities, primarily because the bulk of employees at a university or institutions of higher learning tend to be part-time employees. So if you think about lecturers, if you think about invigilators, it tends to be people that actually are not employed on a full-time basis by the university. So the process of then managing that payroll is quite different to how you'd manage full-time employees. And it can even often result in challenges from making sure that you pay the right people, you pay them the right amount, and you pay them at the right time. So there's an opportunity there again for universities to rely on data and analytics to bridge that gap. And the key message here is that while ultimately you want to automate some of these processes, data and data management provides a bridge for you to be able to do this while you're still developing the various systems. And then underlying all of this is the use of data, or what we call data management. So we've seen a number of challenges that universities face, and more often we've seen these at instances where universities have merged from previous separate entities, where you need to bring separate sets of data from various institutions together. We've seen a number of challenges there, but we've seen increased efforts to make sure that data plays a positive impact in the management of students in terms of relations with employees and suppliers, as opposed to it being something that has a negative impact. Importantly related to data also is the issue of privacy. So as the world becomes more and more automated and system-driven, data plays a more important role. But we also need to be ensuring that we comply with the privacy regulations, and also that we keep external parties and internal parties data secure. So my colleague Kuda will talk a little bit about data privacy and data security, and how it then impacts all of these processes that we've spoken about. Back to you, Kajisa.
Great. Thank you, Teboho. Kuda, please come on board. If you have any questions or comments based on what Teboho has shared, please, I encourage you again to just continuously post, and we'll go through those shortly. Kuda.
Okay, thanks, Kajisa. Like my colleagues Teboho just mentioned earlier on, digital transformation is at the center stage of for many universities. Now, from a cyber perspective, cyber risks are materializing, and they're a threat to the institution's digital transformation and sustainability as universities. You know, cyber attacks like ransomware or flat can end up encrypting information. Students will not have any access to the online courses that we're talking about, to even services that are offered to lecturers as well and staff alike. So universities by nature openly share information and knowledge, and are seen as a gold mine because of the amount of personal information that they process, and such hackers or cyber criminals see them as a gold mine for an opportunity to access that information. They want to grab that information to launch further attacks, even to access it could be bank accounts for the students or staff later on with the information that they can mine from the universities. So cyber criminals see institutions as appetizing. Right, and in addition, they lack they tend to lack awareness. Students and staff tend to lack awareness to emerging cyber risks. So investors need to put in place measures to train, to educate staff and students alike. They have outdated legacy systems, limited cybersecurity budgets, are perceived to have weak security controls, and in addition, they are overzealous students who try to manipulate and access the systems, say to cheat in the examinations, or even to try to access the exam systems to change their exam results, for instance. There's also lack of coordinated and structured response to cyber by education in general. And on top of that, there's quite a number of emerging cyber risks, some of which I alluded to: ransomware, your phishing emails. Of late, there's what is called a CFO or CO fraud, where an email is sent from a CFO or CO, and then it to ask the finance departments to process a payment. And I often get involved in instances where actually some institutions actually process those payments and pay invoices to the cyber criminals. They just manipulate the invoice and change the account details. It will look the same, like a legitimate invoice coming from a supplier, but they just change the account details. And in addition, they are tightening regulatory screws coming through. You see, last year there was a POPIA and the cybercrime that was signed into law. POPIA by itself, the cybercrime law, which enforces a POPIA, basically makes cybersecurity mandatory. You have to put in place processes to ensure that the personal information that you're collecting, and you collect a lot from students and staff, is processed securely. When you're processing or collecting that information, you need to put in place POPIA clauses that that ensure that you obtain that information with the consent of the data subject, in this case, the student, right? Universities need to put in place to pool resources, collaborate, and invest in what we call cyber resilience. Embed cybersecurity in people, process, and technology. Put in place processes and policies to comply with these emerging laws and regulations, your POPIA, your GDPR, your cybercrime law. Regularly assess your cyber risks to identify any loopholes or weaknesses in your systems. Educate students and staff on emerging cyber risks. Develop solutions to identify cyber risks. Protect against these cyber attacks that are coming through. And if it so happens that there's a cyber attack that come through into your network, you need to be able to timely detect it. So basically, you need to invest in monitoring solutions that timely detect any cyber attack when it's happening, and put in place adequate instant response processes to respond to such cyber attacks. And if it so happens that you have, say, you're hit by ransomware or these emerging attacks that we're talking about, you need to be able to timely recover with minimal impact. That is where you need to tie your cybersecurity to the business continuity processes, your disaster recovery processes, to build that cyber resilience that I was talking about earlier. So you also need to put resources in managing the scarcity of skills within the industry. Universities, by nature, are equipped to play a part in awareness to the higher populace in the country as well. And what is also very, very key is to engage cyber experts. As SNG Grant Thornton offer a buffet of solutions to help address these emerging cyber risks, addressing questions like how vulnerable you are to these cyber attacks, and if you are attacked, are you able to detect and respond with minimum impact, and recover with minimum impact if it so happens. So we can partner with universities to build this cyber resilience, and also to offer the scarce skills that the universities face. So we can actually play a dedicated, provide a dedicated team of experts that offer a virtual cybersecurity management solutions to you. And our solutions are built around those pillars I mentioned. You might have heard me mention: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Thank you, colleagues. Back to you, Kanyisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Deboho. Please, sorry. Thank you, Kuda. Please stay online.
Thank you.
Deboho and Tabo, can you please join, and Musi? So we have some questions on the chat. Tabo, if we can just start off with you first. The question in relation to sustainability from Moses, I'll just read it out for the benefit of everyone who hasn't read the question. Says the issues of sustainability and need for revenue enhancement has become an urgent imperative in higher education. Any thoughts from a consulting point of view, more importantly from SNGGT, how we can assist universities in this regard?
All right, thanks, Kanyisa, and thanks, Moses, for the question. I think what is key is that obviously any new initiative that the university must undertake is driven from their strategic plan. And what we then need to do from advisory point of view, we do have a business consulting unit where we need to then, looking at the strategic plan of the institution, then develop a business case as to which areas can they then grow, or which areas can they target. And based on our experience, I think the bigger part of it is that we actually have done a number of enterprise supply development where we supported some of these SMMEs in terms of identifying a market in terms of governance and developing a business that can sustain itself beyond that specific entity that they're working with. And those are the things that we need to look at. But what is key fundamentally is that have a business case that supports, that's informed by the strategic plan of the institution. From there, then you are able to then capacitate that unit, if it's a new entity that's been established, to ensure that the market or the growth of that third stream revenue is actually sustained, and that it continues to support whatever elements, strategic objective that needs to be achieved by the institution. So we have Eugen within the institution who is a leader in terms of business consulting, and they've done a lot of work around establishment of a new market and also to sustain new enterprises in the economy. Thanks, Kanyisa.
Thanks, Thabo. Teboho, one of the concerns is that most of the times consultants lack ERP-specific experience. As a result, the data analytics reports that institutions receive does not add much value to management. Any thoughts on that? That is a question also from Moses.
Thanks, Kanyisa. An interesting aspect of this is that what we've seen in the higher education space is that there's actually very few ERP systems that are being used. So we tend to see commonalities in terms of the ERP systems that are being used. And therefore, one can learn from one university and actually use those lessons across other universities. As an institution, we work with a number of universities, so we've been able to take lessons from one and apply it to the other in terms of that ERP specific knowledge. But answering from a broader consultant perspective, I think one of the challenges is that we too quickly dive into the technical aspect without first understanding the need from a customer perspective. So the need from a management perspective to say, what are you actually trying to achieve? So I think in those projects or processes of building analytics reports, there needs to be enough time invested upfront in understanding the user needs before we dive into the technical aspects. There's also then the opportunity to say you can work with the providers of those ERP systems, because in providing reports that are more meaningful, it only enhances the value of the ERP system itself. So there's a number of approaches that we can take, but ultimately it's around understanding the value that it adds to customers as opposed to only taking a technical approach. Thanks, Kanyisa.
Great. Thank you so much, Teboho. It is exactly 2 minutes to 11. We're scheduled to finish at 11. Those are the only 2 questions that we had. I still encourage you, if you have any questions or comments or experiences that you want to share, to just post them. While we don't have enough time to cover all of those at this point, but we will spend some time after to respond to any questions that were left on the chat. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. We do hope we can have a lot more of these and keep the same level of engagement to ensure that we do add value and we contribute to this important sector. Thank you to the panelists as well, and to Desiree, to Mabuto, to Lebo for organizing the session. Thank you. Have a lovely day further.